Happy Palm Sunday, everybody. Amen. Man, that's a lot of words. But spoiler alert. This is a season where you have to decide what is deadening you, what you need to let go of, what you need to leave behind, who you need to leave behind. You have to detach from all those things that you have been comfortable with, the things that you say are habits but might just be addiction, the things that you say are your personality but are actually contrary to who you actually are, because you're afraid that what if you showed up vulnerable and loving? You would rather show up mean so people can respect you. How do you just let it all go? How do you just let it die? And who will I be if I'm not tough, if I'm not mean, if I'm not masculine presenting, if I'm not standing in my cis hetero patriarchal, body, if I'm not dominating somebody? Who could and would I be if I let it all go? Who will love me? Who will respect me? Is it worth finding out? And I think for a lot of us, we decide to stay in these spaces because we don't know who we are without these things. And I'm here to tell you that it is worth it. That if you have any doubt about if you are loved or made of love, if you have any doubt that you will not be happier, if you have any doubt that you actually have a dream that you have deferred that you will be able to get back to, I am here to tell you that once you get rid of all that stuff, it will be there. And for me, it's like the writing practice. Writing for me is letting go of stuff. Today I write about my bad day. Tomorrow I write about, I won't say their name, who's getting on my nerves. The next day, I'm writing about somebody else. It's usually somebody else. It's never me. But then I write about me. And then under all that, once I let all that go and all that die, you know what's left? Is the real story that's trying to come out. Because there's all this stuff on top of it. And so I'm going to share a poem about what it feels like when you return yourself to yourself on this and in this Easter season. God working overtime gets a phone call. What if God was at work and got a call from Jesus, who was crying and scared, saying, "Now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say, Father? Save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And what if God didn't know what was going on and whispered into the phone outside of the earshot of God's supervisor, "I have both glorified it, Jesus, and I will glorify it again, son." And what if God was at work and got another call from one of Jesus' friends who confirmed that Jesus was indeed in trouble? And what if Jesus' friend told God that some dude threatened to take Jesus down off his high horse? And what if that news made God's knees buckle? And what if God had just gotten this overtime, working graveyard, and couldn't afford another write-up for talking on the phone, on the job, caring for Jesus? And what if God couldn't get off work because God had used up all of God's sick leave from all them other times that Jesus has called God? And what if God comforted God's self, hoping that God taught Jesus right? And what if God was like a lot of mothers in San Francisco and Oakland who regret ever telling their sons to respect the police? And what if in God's spirit, God could hear Jesus crying for God and God couldn't do anything? And what if God's child was about to be killed? And what if God only had God's self to comfort God? And what if God knows who is witnessing his son's murder, and they knew God knew, and they still didn't come forward? What if God felt responsible? What if God remembers saying, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased"? But God also remembers all them other times that God wasn't able to go to back to school night and see Jesus heal lepers or hear him teach at temple because she was trying to make ends meet and make the suppers last. And what if God couldn't bring God's self to go to the police station, identify the body, and ask one of us to do it? What if God didn't have the money to have the body embalmed and had to depend on women like my mama and your mama to take care of it? What if God had to start a GoFundMe? What if God heard the body was absent and missing? Then God heard they wouldn't release the body. Then God heard that they had sealed the autopsy report. What if God knew crucifixion was a pretty word for murder by the state and would not let the coroner list it as the cause of death? What if God couldn't afford a plot at Rolling Hills or Arlington anyway? And what if God couldn't sleep for 40 days because people started to pull God's ears saying they saw Jesus in Jerusalem with his disciples, and Paul up on Black Twitter saying he was on his way to Damascus and Jesus tried to blind him? Then Cleopas' black self just trying to get on the TV and he was on his way to Emmaus and he said he saw Jesus. What if God didn't know what to believe? What if God stopped believing in God's self? What if God lost faith in God? What if God was inconsolable and beside God's self? What if God was rocking God's self, crying for trans kids and women children and man-childs and poor kids and BIPOC kids and white kids and Alateen kids and Tenderloin kids and Glide kids and sex-trafficked kids and undiagnosed and untreated kids and homeless kids and kids raised by grandmothers because their parents were incarcerated? What if God was rocking God's self? And what if it was a day like today and God heard something through God's grief, and God looked up, and there, to God's surprise, was Jesus? What if God can be surprised? What if God didn't know those tears God was crying because God had never planned on having a son having to go through hell just to come home? What if God understood now why God had to be an activist, had to be about that justice? What if God cried harder when Jesus came home than when Jesus left home? What if God leapt from creation towards Jesus and Jesus leapt from death towards God and they collapsed into each other's arms like they were both running away from somebody? And what if that hug is what all of creation feels like when we see ourselves as God? When we see ourselves coming back to ourselves, when we see ourselves as God's children. And what if God swore that God would never step foot in another church until all churches proclaim, not just on their letterhead and on their splash pages of their website, but in their culture, that Black Lives Matter because we are all precious in God's sight? And what if God's children back in God's arms is what this Palm Sunday is all leading up to? What if God doesn't know what happens when we die? So when God sees you, it's like the first time God is holding God's child. And what if God does not want to rehearse this response? What if God becomes God every time one of us makes it home? And what if we are promised that we will all make it home? What if the God of the outpouring is the God of the inflowing, leaping up and opening God's self to receive us like a child coming home after a report to the contrary? What if God gets to pray and we get to be God's answer every time? What if? What if? What if? What if I'm telling you on this Palm Sunday, even though you think you know how the story ends, you don't, but it's worth it. Amen.